the night sky with a searing brilliance that left Flint momentarily blinded. As Flint's vision cleared, he saw the armored truck and its soldiers being pushed back by an immense wave of energy. The street was bathed in light, and the force of the explosion sent debris and soldiers scattering. Flint's heart pounded as he struggled to comprehend the sight before him. Zox, in the middle of the chaos, was no longer just a baby. He was channeling a power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The soldiers scrambled to their feet, their faces reflecting a mix of fear and determination as they tried to regroup. The truck was overturned, its metal frame twisted and smoking. ZYX stopped. Flint shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the roar of the energy surrounding them. He could see the baby's eyes glowing fiercely as he maintained the barrier of light. It was clear now that ZYX's powers were beyond what Flint had initially understood. They were not just a tool for defense. They were a force capable of immense destruction. The soldiers, realizing the futility of their advance, began retreating, their disciplined formations breaking as they fled. The truck's engine roared again, and the vehicle reversed, its tires screeching as it sped away from the scene. Flint watched in a mixture of disbelief and concern as X's energy slowly waned, the blinding light dimming to a soft, pulsating glow. The baby wavered, almost collapsing from exhaustion. Flint rushed forward, catching Zex just before he fell, cradling the tiny figure in his arms. "Zex, it's okay," Flint said, his voice trembling with relief and fear. "You're safe now. I've got you." Zex's eyes fluttered weakly, his glow fading to a gentle shimmer as he rested against Flint's chest. The workshop, once a haven of safety, now felt like a fragile sanctuary amid a world that seemed to be falling apart around them. Max and the villagers, who had followed from a distance, approached cautiously. Their faces were etched with a mixture of awe and apprehension, reflecting the enormity of what they had just witnessed. "What did we just see?" Max asked, her voice hushed as she took in the damage and the weary figure of Zex. Flint glanced at her, still holding the baby close. ZYX is more powerful than we imagined. He's capable of far greater things than just creating light or levitating objects. We need to be extremely careful. The regime is aware of him now, and they won't stop until they have him or destroy him. Max nodded, her expression resolute. "We need to regroup and plan our next steps. The community is safe for now, but we have to find a way to keep Zex hidden and protect him from both the scavengers and the regime." Flint agreed, his gaze falling back to Zex, who had drifted into a fragile sleep in his arms. The baby had exhausted himself in their desperate battle, but Flint knew the real challenge lay ahead. The path they were on was fraught with danger, and their enemies were relentless. As the night settled over the city, Flint made a silent promise to Zex. He would protect him, no matter the cost. Together, they would face whatever came next, forging a new path through the darkness that had long enveloped their world. The journey ahead was uncertain, but with Zex by his side, Flint felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could make a difference. In the shadows of the crumbling city, Flint and Zex were ready to face the challenges of an uncertain future, their bond stronger than ever. Area, flooding the street with an intense, searing light that seemed to pierce through the darkness and the fog of fear. Flint shielded his eyes, struggling to stay upright as the light intensified. The oppressive weight of the regime's presence was momentarily overwhelmed by the radiance emanating from Zex. When the light finally receded, Flint slowly lowered his arm, peering through the haze. The armored truck and its soldiers were nowhere to be seen. The street was eerily silent, illuminated by the soft, lingering glow from Zex's tiny form. Flint's heart raced, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Duh," he shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and dread. The baby's energy had seemingly driven the soldiers away, but Flint was acutely aware of the danger that still lurked. Zex floated down to the ground, his eyes wide and weary. The glowing aura around him had dimmed, leaving him looking fragile and exhausted. Flint hurried over, scooping the baby up into his arms, his heart aching with concern. "What did you do?" Flint asked, his voice trembling. Zex looked up at him, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that Flint couldn't fully understand. It was clear that whatever had happened, ZYX was deeply affected by it. A distant rumble of engines signaled the regime's continued search. Flint knew they couldn't stay here. He glanced around, assessing their options. The alleyways, once a possible escape route, were now compromised. "Come on, we need to move," Flint urged, his tone resolute. He adjusted his grip on ZYX, who clung to him with a surprising strength. The baby's previous display of power had created a temporary reprieve, but Flint knew it wouldn't last long. As they hurried through the alleyways, Flint's mind raced with strategies and concerns. The community they had sought refuge in was no longer safe, and the scavengers' threats had escalated into a real and immediate danger. ZYX's abilities had proven to be a double-edged sword, offering protection but also drawing unwanted attention. Finally, they reached a more secluded part of the city, away from the immediate threat. Flint found a derelict building that seemed to offer some shelter. He eased Wex down onto a dusty old mattress, brushing off some of the grime and debris. The baby's eyes fluttered, exhaustion evident in his delicate features. "Rest here for a moment," Flint said softly, his voice weary but gentle. "We bought ourselves some time, but we need to plan our next move." Wex looked up at him, his expression one of both weariness and curiosity. Flint took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. The situation was dire, but he knew they had to keep moving forward. He began to sift through their supplies, trying to find anything that could be of use. As he worked, his mind wandered back to the encounter with Max and the community. Despite the danger, he had seen a glimmer of hope, a possibility that ZYX's presence could rally people to their cause. With that in mind, Flint made a decision. He would return to the community, but this time with a plan. They needed to build alliances, find resources, and develop a strategy to protect ZYX from both the scavengers and the regime. "We'll need to head back," Flint said, more to himself than to ZYX. "But we need to do it carefully." ZYX made a soft, comforting sound, his small hand reaching out to touch Flint's. It was a gesture of reassurance, one that reminded Flint of the bond they shared and the purpose that had driven them through the chaos. The night was silent, the occasional distant sound a reminder of the world outside. Flint knew that their journey was far from over. But as he looked at ZYX, he felt a renewed sense of determination. They would face the challenges ahead together, no matter how formidable they seemed. With a final glance around their temporary refuge, Flint gathered his things and prepared to leave. The road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty, but with ZYX by his side, he felt a spark of hope that had been missing for too long. They would navigate the treacherous path ahead, forging their way through the darkness toward a future that, for the first time in a long while, seemed just within reach. As Flint and ZYX prepared to move, Flint's thoughts churned with plans and worries. The city outside was a maze of shadows and danger, but Flint knew they couldn't remain hidden forever. The regime's reach was vast, and the scavengers' threat loomed large. They needed allies, resources, and a way to safeguard ZYX from those who would exploit his powers. Flint took one last look at their temporary hideout before stepping cautiously into the street. The night was still, but the oppressive sense of danger lingered. He wrapped ZYX in a tattered blanket, trying to make the baby as inconspicuous as possible. The blanket, though worn, had comforting warmth that Flint hoped would provide some solace. As they moved through the alleyways, Flint's thoughts kept drifting back to Max and the community they had briefly encountered. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, there had been a spark of unity and hope. Flint realized that if he could reach out to Max and the others, they might stand a chance against the regime's relentless pursuit. Navigating through the narrow streets, Flint kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings. The city's crumbling infrastructure and shadowy corners seemed to close in on them. The faint sound of distant engines reminded Flint of the regime's patrols, a constant reminder of their perilous situation. They reached the outskirts of the community's area, where the makeshift barriers and guarded checkpoints marked a more secure zone. Flint approached with caution, knowing that their previous encounter might not have left the best impression. He needed to be strategic, convincing Max and the others that their alliance could be mutually beneficial. With ZYX nestled securely in his arms, Flint approached the community's outer perimeter. The guards, still on high alert, eyed him warily. Flint raised his hands in a gesture of peace, hoping to avoid any unnecessary conflict. "Hey, it's Flint," he called out, his voice steady but urgent. "I need to speak with Max. It's important." The guards exchanged uncertain glances but nodded, allowing Flint to pass under the wary watch of their eyes. Flint moved quickly toward the central meeting area, hoping that Max was still there and that the community was receptive to his plea for help. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but more controlled. A few familiar faces turned to look as Flint entered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Max was standing near a table cluttered with maps and supplies, engaged in a discussion with several other leaders. "Flint," Max said, his voice carrying a note of surprise. "What are you doing back here?" "I thought you were. I need your help, Flint interrupted, his tone urgent. The regime is hunting us, and they're not the only threat. There's someone who could be a powerful asset in our fight, but we need to protect him. Max's gaze shifted to Zex, who peered out from the blanket with wide, innocent eyes. Max's expression softened, a flicker of recognition and concern crossing his face. Who is this? Max asked, his tone cautious but intrigued. This is ZYX, Flint explained. He's not just any baby. He has abilities, powers that could turn the tide against our enemies. But those powers also make him a target. The regime and the scavengers both want him. Max studied ZX for a moment before nodding slowly. All right, Flint. We'll listen. But you need to understand that our resources are stretched thin, and we're constantly under threat. Flint nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. I know. But if we work together, we might stand a chance. We need to fortify our defenses, find a way to harness ZX's abilities, and build alliances beyond these walls. Max motioned for Flint to follow him to a quieter corner of the meeting area. The other leaders gathered around, their expressions a mix of skepticism and hope. Flint outlined the situation in detail, explaining the dangers they faced and the potential of ZYX's abilities. As he spoke, Flint could see the shifts in the room's atmosphere. The leaders exchanged looks of concern and contemplation. Max remained silent, listening intently. After Flint finished, Max spoke up. All right, Flint. We'll consider what you've said. But we need more than just words. We need a plan. Flint nodded, his mind already racing with ideas. I have a few suggestions, but we need to act quickly. The longer we wait, the more vulnerable we become. Max agreed, and the group began discussing possible strategies. Flint provided input on defensive measures, resource management, and ways to integrate ZYX's abilities into their plans. The conversation was intense, filled with a mix of hope and pragmatic concerns. As the meeting progressed, Flint felt a renewed sense of purpose. The community was receptive, and the possibility of collaboration was a glimmer of hope in their bleak world. ZYX, still nestled in Flint's arms, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, his small form radiating a gentle warmth. The night wore on, and Flint knew they had taken the first steps toward a critical alliance. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but the combined strength of their efforts offered a sliver of hope in an otherwise dark and uncertain future. With plans set in motion and a tentative alliance forming, Flint prepared to face the trials ahead, knowing that their fight was far from over. But with ZYX's potential and the community's support, they had a chance to make a difference, no matter how small it might seem. As the meeting concluded, Flint felt a cautious optimism. The leaders of the community had agreed to help, but the path ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. Flint knew that the real work was just beginning. Max approached Flint as the other leaders began to disperse. We'll need to get you and ZYX settled somewhere safe for the night, Max said. We have a few safe houses that should be well secured. But first, we need to talk strategy. Flint followed Max through the winding corridors of the community's compound. The place was a hive of activity, with people moving purposefully as they went about their tasks. Despite the challenges they faced, there was a sense of determination that Flint found reassuring. They reached a small, sparsely furnished room that Max indicated would be Flint's temporary quarters. It wasn't much, but it was clean and secure. Max offered Flint a tired but sincere smile. This should be a safe place for you and ZYX. I'll arrange for some supplies and see to it that you have everything you need. Thanks, Max, Flint replied, settling ZYX into a makeshift crib that Max had prepared. ZYX seemed to be taking the chaos in stride, his wide eyes darting around with curious fascination. Flint found some comfort in the normalcy of caring for the baby, even amidst the turmoil. I know things are rough, Max said, his tone softening as he looked at the baby. But we're going to do everything we can to help. The community might be small, but we have resources and connections that can make a difference. Flint nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. I appreciate it. I'll be honest, I'm not sure what to expect from the regime or the scavengers. But if we can find a way to protect ZYX and leverage his abilities, we might be able to turn the tide. Max's gaze was thoughtful. I've heard whispers of some potential allies beyond our immediate reach. Other groups, individuals with their own agendas, but who might be willing to work with us. It could be worth exploring those connections. Flint's interest was piqued. Do you have any leads or contacts? Max hesitated. We've had some communication with a few groups in the outer districts. They're not always reliable, but they might be able to provide additional support or intelligence. I'll see what I can find out and get back to you. As Max left to make arrangements, Flint took a moment to reflect. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. He glanced over at Zex, who was now sleeping peacefully, a small, vulnerable figure in a world that seemed determined to crush anything tender or hopeful. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Flint unpacked supplies, organized their limited resources, and made sure ZYX was comfortable. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that their situation was on a knife's edge. The regime's presence was a constant threat, and the scavenger's ruthless nature added another layer of danger. Just before dawn, Max returned with news. "I've made contact with a few potential allies," he said, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism. "They're willing to meet, but we'll need to be careful. Trust is a precious commodity in these times." Flint nodded. "I understand. What's the plan?" "We'll arrange a meeting with one of these contacts," Max explained. "They have information about the regime's patrols and might be able to help us with logistics and intelligence. But we'll need to be discreet and prepared for anything." Flint agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Protecting ZYX was his primary concern, but finding allies and gathering resources was crucial for their survival. Over the next few days, Flint and Max worked tirelessly. They fortified their defenses, gathered supplies, and established communication channels with their new allies. Each step forward was fraught with danger, but the support from Max and the community provided a glimmer of hope. As Flint navigated this precarious balance between security and strategy, he couldn't help but think about the future. The path was uncertain, and the threats were ever present, but the prospect of a united front against their enemies offered a small measure of hope. One evening, as Flint prepared for another strategy meeting, he looked down at ZYX, who was playing with small, colorful toy Max had provided. The baby's laughter was a rare and precious sound in their harsh reality, a reminder of what they were fighting for. Flint vowed to protect this small spark of hope and to fight for a future where ZYX and everyone else could find peace and safety. The road ahead was filled with challenges, but with determination, alliances, and a bit of luck, Flint hoped they could forge a path to a brighter future. As days turned into weeks, Flint and Max continued their tireless efforts to secure their position and build alliances. The compound, while modest, became a hub of activity and planning. Flint's interactions with the various factions and individuals they had connected with revealed a complex web of loyalties, rivalries, and hidden agendas. One evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the compound, Flint and Max gathered in the secure room to discuss their next move. Flint was exhausted but determined, and Max's face bore the marks of sleepless nights and relentless pressure. "We've managed to strengthen our defenses," Max said, spreading out a series of maps and notes across the table. "Our new allies have been instrumental in providing intel on the regime's movements. But there's still a lot of uncertainty." Flint glanced at the maps. "What's the status of our potential allies? Any updates on their reliability?" Max sighed. "Some are proving more trustworthy than others. The outer districts are a patchwork of factions, each with their own interests. But we've made headway with a few key players. There's one contact, Aaron, who seems particularly reliable. They've provided useful information about the regime's patrol patterns and have offered to support us with supplies." "That's good news," Flint replied. "But we need to ensure that Aaron's intentions align with ours. How do we verify their trustworthiness?" Max nodded. "We've done some background checks and have a few trusted intermediaries who can vouch for Aaron. However, it's always wise to proceed with caution. We should arrange a meeting with them to discuss terms and gauge their commitment." Flint agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "Let's set up a meeting. If Aaron proves to be a reliable ally, their support could be crucial in fortifying our position and expanding our network." As they finalized the arrangements for the meeting, Flint took a moment to check on ZX, who was sleeping peacefully in the corner of the room. The baby had become a symbol of hope and resilience for Flint, and he found solace in the small moments of normalcy. Later that week, Flint and Max traveled to a neutral location for the meeting with Aaron. The rendezvous point was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript building that had been repurposed for clandestine gatherings. Aaron, a lean figure with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, greeted them at the door. "Flint, Max. I'm Aaron. Thank you for meeting me." Flint nodded, extending a hand. "Thank you for making the time. We're looking for support and reliable information." Your reputation precedes you. Aaron shook hands and led them inside. The warehouse was surprisingly well organized, with a makeshift command center set up in one corner. Aaron's team appeared to be a mix of skilled operatives and resourceful individuals. As they settled into the conversation, Aaron laid out a series of maps and documents. "Here's what we know about the regime's recent movements," Aaron said, pointing to various locations. "Their patrols have been more erratic lately, likely due to increased internal tensions. We've also identified a few key supply routes that might be vulnerable to disruption." Flint studied the information, feeling a growing sense of clarity. "This is exactly the kind of intel we need." "What you require from us in return?" Aaron's gaze was steady. "We need assurances that any collaboration will be mutually beneficial. My people have been working hard to gather this information, and we've put ourselves at risk in the process. We're looking for support, both in terms of resources and protection." Max interjected. "We can offer support in the form of supplies and coordination. We're also prepared to provide additional assistance if needed." Aaron considered this for a moment. "That sounds reasonable. We'll need to establish a secure line of communication and coordinate our efforts carefully. But if we can work together, I believe we can make a significant impact." The meeting concluded with a tentative agreement. Flint and Max returned to the compound with a sense of cautious optimism. Aaron's support could be a game-changer, but it was clear that building trust would take time and effort. Over the following weeks, Flint and his team worked diligently to integrate Aaron's information and resources into their strategy. They launched a series of coordinated efforts to disrupt the regime's supply lines and gather more intelligence on their activities. Each success was a small victory, but the overall situation remained precarious. Despite the progress, Flint could not ignore the growing sense of unease. The regime's response to their disruptions was becoming more aggressive, and the threat of a major crackdown loomed on the horizon. The scavengers, too, were a constant threat, their presence a shadowy reminder of the dangers lurking just outside their defenses. One evening, as Flint prepared for another strategy session, he received a message from Aaron. The tone was urgent, and the contents were troubling. "Flint, we've received word that the regime is planning a major operation in the coming days. It's a significant escalation, and we believe it's aimed at crushing any opposition. We need to act quickly if we're going to counter this move." Flint's heart raced as he relayed the message to Max. "We need to prepare for a major offensive. If the regime is moving to eliminate us, we have to be ready to respond." Max's face was grim but determined. "We'll need to mobilize our allies, fortify our defenses, and devise a counter-strategy. It's going to be a challenge, but we've come this far. We can't back down now." As Flint looked at ZX, who was once again sleeping soundly, he felt a renewed surge of resolve. The fight ahead would be tough, but the stakes were high, and the future of their community depended on their ability to stand firm and resist. With a sense of urgency, Flint and his team began preparations for the impending conflict. They knew that the coming days would be crucial in determining their fate. As they rallied their allies and fortified their position, Flint held on to the hope that their combined efforts would be enough to turn the tide in their favor. The battle for their survival was far from over, but Flint was determined to face it head-on, with courage and determination guiding every step. The days leading up to the regime's planned offensive were marked by a frenetic pace of activity. Flint and his team worked around the clock, coordinating with Aaron and their other allies, fortifying the compound, and strategizing their response. Max was particularly focused on enhancing the compound's defenses. Sandbags and makeshift barricades were being constructed, and they set up additional watchpoints to monitor any unusual activity. Flint's role was to ensure that their allies were synchronized and that everyone was clear on their roles and responsibilities. The tension was palpable, but so was the determination in everyone's eyes. As the deadline approached, Flint received a visit from Aaron at the compound. They spoke in the secure room, away from prying ears. "This operation is unlike anything we've seen before," Aaron said, spreading out a new set of intelligence reports. "The regime is mobilizing a large force, and their strategy involves a coordinated assault on key points in the city. They aim to crush any organized resistance." Flint studied the documents, his mind racing. "What's our best course of action?" "We need to anticipate their moves and protect our vulnerable points." Aaron nodded, tapping a specific area on the map. "We've identified a few critical points they're likely to target. Our best bet is to focus on fortifying these areas and preparing for a potential counteroffensive. We should also consider launching a diversionary attack to draw some of their forces away from our main position. Flint turned to Max, who had been listening intently. What do you think of this plan? Max's face was set in a determined expression. It's risky, but it might be our best chance. If we can create enough confusion and disrupt their plans, we might be able to turn the tide. We'll need to mobilize our forces and ensure everyone knows their role. With their strategy in place, Flint and his team began the final preparations. They distributed weapons, organized defensive positions, and coordinated with their allies to ensure that everyone was ready. The compound was abuzz with activity, and there was an air of anxious anticipation as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. On the eve of the regime's offensive, Flint found a rare moment of quiet. He stood on the compound's roof, looking out over the city. The skyline, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed shadowed and somber. The weight of the coming battle hung heavy in the air. SCI-Fi, now a few months older, was sleeping peacefully in the makeshift nursery. Flint couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, knowing that the world SCI-Fi would grow up in was uncertain and fraught with danger. But he also felt a fierce determination to protect this small life, community they had fought so hard to build. The first signs of the regime's attack came just before dawn. Explosions rocked the city as their forces began their coordinated assault. Flint and Max sprang into action, directing their team to their defensive positions and coordinating with Aaron's group. The initial wave of attacks targeted the outer defenses, where Flint's preparations had paid off. The barricades and sandbags held firm, and their defensive positions managed to repel the first onslaught. The diversionary attack that Aaron's team had launched drew some of the regime's forces away, providing a brief but crucial respite. But the regime's assault was relentless. They pushed forward with a combination of heavy artillery and infantry, determined to breach the defenses and crush any resistance. Flint and Max worked tirelessly to maintain their positions, but it became increasingly clear that they were facing overwhelming odds. In the midst of the chaos, Flint received another message from Aaron. The communication was frantic and fragmented. We're surrounded. The regime's forces have split into smaller units and are closing in. We're trying to hold them off, but we need immediate reinforcements. Flint's heart sank. They were in the thick of the battle, but the dire situation demanded quick thinking. He turned to Max. We need to shift our focus and provide support to Aaron's position. We can't let them be overwhelmed. Max nodded. I'll coordinate the reinforcements. You focus on rallying the remaining forces and pushing back against the regime's advance. Flint and his team moved swiftly, rallying the remaining forces and launching a counter-assault against the regime's troops. The battle was fierce, with every inch of ground fought for with determination and desperation. Flint felt a mix of exhaustion and adrenaline as he led his team, fighting to hold back the tide of enemy forces. In a moment of clarity amidst the chaos, Flint spotted Aaron fighting alongside their allies. Despite the dire situation, Aaron's presence was a beacon of hope. Flint made his way through the battlefield, joining forces with Aaron to press the attack and push back the regime's forces. The battle raged on, and the hours seemed to stretch into an eternity. Flint and his team fought valiantly, their efforts starting to make a difference. Slowly but surely, they managed to push back the regime's forces and regain some control of the situation. As the sun began to set, the intensity of the battle began to wane. The regime's advance had been halted, and the immediate threat had been pushed back. Flint and his allies were battered and bruised, but they had survived the initial assault. Flint found Aaron amidst the aftermath, both of them exhausted but relieved. We held them off, but it was close. How's your team? Aaron nodded, though their expression was weary. We've sustained heavy losses, but we managed to fend them off. We couldn't have done it without your support. Flint glanced back at the compound, where the survivors were regrouping and tending to their wounded. We've made it through this round, but we need to prepare for what comes next. The regime won't give up easily. Aaron agreed. We'll need to regroup, rebuild, and strengthen our defenses. The fight is far from over. As night fell, Flint took a moment to reflect on the day's events. The battle had been a brutal reminder of the stakes they faced, but it also demonstrated the strength and resilience of their alliance. The fight for survival was ongoing, but they had shown that they were capable of facing the challenges head-on. In the days that followed, Flint and his team worked tirelessly to recover from the battle, mourn their losses, and prepare for the next phase of their struggle. The future remained uncertain, but Flint's resolve was unwavering. He knew that their fight was far from over, but he was determined to face it with courage, resilience, and the unwavering hope that their efforts would ultimately lead to a better future. With the immediate threat of the regime's assault pushed back, Flint and his team were faced with the monumental task of rebuilding and preparing for the inevitable next wave. The compound, once a beacon of hope, was now a scarred testament to the fierce battle they had endured. The days following the attack were a blur of activity. Flint and Max coordinated with Aaron and their allies to assess the damage, tend to the wounded, and fortify their defenses. The mood was somber but resolute. Each member of their team carried the weight of their losses and the burden of the ongoing fight. Flint took a moment to visit the makeshift infirmary where the wounded were being treated. ZX was safely with a trusted caretaker, but Flint's heart ached with worry for the little one. He scanned the room, seeing familiar faces, some wounded gravely, others with less severe injuries. Each person's pain was a reminder of the cost of their struggle. Dr. Elise, their medical officer, looked up from tending to a patient. "Flint, we're doing all we can, but the injuries are severe. We're short on supplies, and we need more medical personnel." Flint nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "I'll see what I can do. We need to get more supplies and reinforcements as soon as possible. I'll also reach out to our allies to see if they can provide additional support." Max approached, his face drawn but determined. "We've managed to shore up the defenses for now, but we need to plan our next move. The regime won't rest after their failed assault. We need to anticipate their next attack and prepare accordingly." Flint and Max spent long hours strategizing with Aaron and their other allies. They pored over maps and intelligence reports, trying to predict the regime's next moves. The regime's forces were formidable, and their tactics were ruthless. It became clear that they needed a multi-pronged strategy to counter the regime's capabilities. "We need to disrupt their supply lines and communication," Aaron suggested. "If we can weaken their logistics, it might buy us some time and create opportunities for counterattacks." Flint agreed. "We'll need to coordinate with our informants and sabotage their operations. We also need to keep up the pressure on their forces, not just defensively, but offensively as well." The days turned into weeks, and Flint's team carried out a series of daring operations aimed at disrupting the regime's supply lines. They conducted sabotage missions, intercepted communications, and executed guerrilla-style attacks on enemy convoys. Each operation was a high-risk endeavor, but they were necessary to maintain their advantage and disrupt the regime's momentum. Despite their best efforts, the regime regrouped and began preparing for another assault. The city remained a tense and volatile place, with frequent skirmishes and ongoing clashes between resistance forces and regime troops. One evening, as Flint reviewed the latest intelligence reports, he received an urgent message from Aaron. "Flint, we've received word that the regime is planning another major offensive. They're massing their forces and preparing for a full-scale assault. We need to be ready." Flint's heart sank. The prospect of another large-scale attack was daunting, but he knew they had no choice but to face it head-on. "We need to finalize our defensive plans and ensure that all our forces are in position. We also need to prepare for potential evacuation routes and contingency plans in case things go south." Max and Flint spent the night coordinating their final preparations. They fortified their defensive positions, established fallback plans, and ensured that every member of their team was aware of their role in the upcoming battle. As dawn broke, the regime's forces began their assault with renewed vigor. The intensity of the attack was overwhelming, and Flint and his team fought valiantly to hold the ground. The battle was fierce and unrelenting, with each side pushing their limits. Flint and Max worked in tandem, directing their forces and coordinating counterattacks. The defensive lines held, but the regime's troops were relentless. The fight was exhausting, with every moment fraught with danger. Amidst the chaos, Flint noticed a significant breach in one of the defensive lines. He rallied a group of fighters and moved to shore up the vulnerable point. The situation was critical, and Flint's leadership and bravery inspired those around him. They managed to repel the immediate threat and stabilize the position, but the battle was far from over. The fighting continued throughout the day, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Flint's team held their positions, but it was clear that the regime's forces were determined to break through. As night fell, the intensity of the battle began to wane. The regime's forces, though battered, were still pressing their attack. Flint and his team, exhausted but resolute, prepared for another night of fighting. In the midst of the chaos, Flint took a moment to look at the compound and the people he was fighting to protect. Despite the immense challenges they faced, their spirit and determination remained unbroken. Flint knew that their struggle was far from over, but he also knew that they had proven their resilience and strength. The days that followed were a testament to their perseverance. The regime's offensive had been repelled, but the cost was high. Flint and his team continued to rebuild, regroup, and prepare for the challenges ahead. The fight for survival was ongoing, but Flint's resolve remained unwavering. He knew that their struggle was a long and difficult one, but he was determined to face it with courage, hope, and the unwavering belief that their efforts would ultimately lead to a better future for their city and their people. In the aftermath of the latest regime assault, Flint and his team faced the daunting task of rebuilding their defenses and recovering from the heavy losses they had sustained. The compound, though still standing, was a shadow of its former self, marred by the scars of battle. The wounded were numerous, and the loss of several key members of their team left a palpable void. Flint knew that the next steps were crucial. The regime's forces were not likely to relent easily, and their persistence meant that the resistance had to be equally determined and resourceful. He convened a strategy meeting with Max, Aaron, and the remaining senior members of their alliance. "We need to focus on two fronts," Flint began, laying out a map of the region. "First, we must continue to bolster our defenses and ensure that our positions are as fortified as possible. Second, we need to disrupt the regime's operations and supply lines to weaken their capacity to sustain their assaults." Aaron nodded in agreement. "We've already had some success with sabotage, but we need to escalate our efforts. If we can strike at their supply depots and command centers, we can create significant delays and disorganization within their ranks." Max, who had been analyzing the latest intelligence reports, added, "We've identified several key targets that, if hit, could cripple their logistics. However, we'll need more resources and personnel to execute these missions effectively." Flint's eyes narrowed as he considered their options. "We'll need to reach out to our allies for additional support. It's crucial that we maintain the momentum and continue pushing back against the regime. I'll personally contact our contacts and request reinforcements and supplies." The meeting continued into the night, with Flint and his team strategizing and coordinating their next moves. They identified key targets for sabotage, mapped out potential routes for guerrilla operations, and discussed contingency plans for any possible scenarios. As dawn broke, Flint set out to implement their plans. He met with their allies, securing additional supplies and reinforcements. He also worked closely with their intelligence network to gather more information on the regime's movements and strategies. The next several weeks were marked by a series of high-stakes operations. Flint's team executed daring sabotage missions, attacking supply convoys and disrupting communication lines. These actions caused significant logistical problems for the regime, slowing down their ability to mount coordinated assaults. Despite these successes, the regime remained a formidable adversary. Their response was swift and brutal, launching retaliatory attacks and increasing their pressure on the resistance. Flint and his team faced a relentless and determined enemy, and the fight continued to be grueling and dangerous. One evening, after a particularly intense day of skirmishes, Flint took a moment to visit the injured and check on their progress. He found Dr. Elise in the infirmary, working tirelessly to care for the wounded. "How are things here?" Flint asked, his voice tinged with concern. Dr. Elise looked up, her face weary but resolute. "We're managing as best as we can. The influx of casualties has been overwhelming, but we've managed to stabilize most of the critical cases. We still need more medical supplies and personnel, though." Flint nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll see what I can do to secure additional resources. Thank you for everything you and your team are doing." With that, Flint returned to the command center. He knew that their fight was far from over, and every day presented new challenges and obstacles. However, he remained determined to press on, driven by the hope that their efforts would eventually lead to a decisive victory. As the days turned into weeks, the resistance managed to regain some ground. Their sabotage operations continued to disrupt the regime's supply lines, and their defensive positions were increasingly fortified. Flint's leadership and the bravery of his team inspired those around them, fostering a sense of unity and resilience within the ranks. Despite the progress, the regime's forces remained a constant threat. Their tactics were evolving, and they continued to adapt to the resistance's strategies. Flint and his team had to stay one step ahead, constantly adjusting their plans and maintaining their vigilance. One night, as Flint reviewed the latest intelligence, he received an urgent message from Aaron. "Flint, We've intercepted a communication suggesting that the regime is planning something big. It looks like they're preparing for a major offensive in the coming days. Flint's heart raced as he processed the information. We need to prepare for the worst. Make sure our defenses are fully operational, and let's start organizing our forces for a potential large-scale engagement. The days leading up to the anticipated offensive were tense and filled with activity. Flint and his team worked tirelessly to prepare for the imminent assault, knowing that this could be a turning point in their struggle. As the regime's forces gathered and prepared for their attack, Flint's team braced themselves for what promised to be one of the most intense battles they had faced. They fortified their positions, coordinated with their allies, and made final preparations for the impending clash. When the regime's offensive finally began, it was with overwhelming force. The skies were filled with the roar of aircraft, and the ground shook with the impact of artillery and explosions. Flint and his team fought with everything they had, determined to defend their position and protect the people they had sworn to defend. The battle was fierce and unrelenting, with both sides pushing their limits. Flint's leadership and strategic acumen were crucial in coordinating their defenses and counterattacks. Despite the heavy losses and the brutal nature of the conflict, Flint remained steadfast, driven by the hope that their efforts would ultimately lead to victory. As the battle raged on, Flint and his team faced immense challenges, but their spirit and determination remained unbroken. The fight for their city and their future continued, and Flint knew that their struggle was far from over. But as long as they had the will to fight, they would continue to stand against the regime and strive for a better tomorrow. As the battle continued, Flint and his team fought valiantly to hold their ground. The regime's forces pressed hard, launching wave after wave of attacks, but Flint's strategic planning and the courage of his team made a significant difference on the battlefield. Flint was everywhere, coordinating efforts, directing reinforcements, and tending to critical points of defense. The cacophony of gunfire, explosions, and shouts filled the air, creating a chaotic and relentless environment. Despite the confusion, Flint maintained a clear head, focusing on the broader picture and making split-second decisions that would impact the outcome of the battle. In one of the more intense moments, Flint and Aaron found themselves at a crucial checkpoint under heavy fire. The enemy had broken through in that sector, and it was vital to regain control to prevent a full-scale breach. "We can't let them through here, Flint," Aaron shouted over the roar of gunfire. "If they get past, it'll be a massacre." Flint nodded, determination etched on his face. "We hold this position at all costs. Reinforcements are on the way, but we need to buy them time." They took up positions behind makeshift barricades, engaging the enemy with precision. Flint's tactical prowess shone as he directed fire and coordinated with snipers positioned on the perimeter. Slowly but surely, they managed to push the enemy back, regaining control of the checkpoint. As the battle progressed, Flint's team faced not only the challenge of direct combat, but also the mental and emotional toll of the prolonged conflict. Flint noticed that morale was beginning to wane amongst some of his fighters, and he knew it was crucial to address this issue. One evening, amidst the temporary lull in fighting, Flint gathered his team for a brief respite and a morale-boosting speech. They sat in a makeshift assembly area, exhaustion and determination visible on their faces. "I know these days have been long and the battle's relentless," Flint began, his voice steady and reassuring. "But what we're fighting for is worth every sacrifice. We're not just defending our homes. We're fighting for our future, for the freedom of our people, and for the hope of a better world. Every one of you has shown incredible courage and resilience. Remember why we started this fight and let that drive us forward. We're not alone in this. Together, we're strong, and together, we will prevail." The speech seemed to reinvigorate the team, their spirits lifted by Flint's words. They returned to their posts with renewed energy, ready to continue the fight. In the days that followed, the regime's offensive began to wane. The combined efforts of Flint's team, their strategic maneuvers, and the disruption of the regime's supply lines had taken a toll. The regime's forces, stretched thin and facing mounting casualties, began to retreat. Despite the victory, Flint was keenly aware of the cost. The compound had suffered significant damage, and many of their allies had been lost or injured. Flint made it a priority to honor those who had fallen, organizing a memorial service to pay tribute to their bravery and sacrifice. During the memorial, Flint addressed the gathered survivors. "Today, we remember those who gave their lives in this struggle. Their sacrifice is a testament to their courage and their belief in our cause. Let us honor their memory by continuing the fight with the same resolve and commitment they showed." We owe it to them to see this through to the end. The memorial was a solemn but unifying moment for the resistance. It reinforced their determination and solidarity, even in the face of adversity. With the regime's immediate threats somewhat diminished, Flint and his team turned their focus to recovery and rebuilding. They worked tirelessly to repair the compound, replenish supplies, and heal both the physical and emotional wounds inflicted by the conflict. In the weeks that followed, Flint and his team continued to press their advantage, exploiting the regime's weakened state to regain lost territory and strengthen their position. They maintained a vigilant stance, knowing that the regime was likely to regroup and attempt to reassert control. Amid the recovery efforts, Flint received a message from one of their key allies, who had been working undercover within the regime's ranks. The intelligence revealed that the regime was planning a significant counteroffensive, gathering resources and consolidating their forces for another major push. Flint knew that they needed to be prepared for the possibility of renewed conflict. He convened a strategy session with his senior leaders to assess their readiness and plan their next steps. "We've made significant progress, but we can't afford to be complacent," Flint said, outlining the intelligence. "We need to strengthen our defenses further and prepare for the regime's counteroffensive. Let's focus on reinforcing our strategic positions and improving our intelligence capabilities." As Flint and his team worked diligently to prepare for the anticipated counteroffensive, they continued to inspire hope and resilience among their people. The resistance had proven its strength and determination, but the road ahead remained challenging. The ongoing struggle against the regime was far from over, but Flint's leadership and the unwavering commitment of his team kept the flame of hope alive. With every victory and every setback, they grew stronger and more resolute, driven by the vision of a future free from oppression and tyranny. As Flint's team prepared for the regime's counteroffensive, their days were filled with intense planning and fortification. The compound became a hive of activity as engineers and strategists worked side by side to strengthen defenses and optimize their strategies. Flint oversaw the reinforcement of key defensive positions. Sandbags, barricades, and makeshift fortifications sprang up around the perimeter, turning the compound into a formidable stronghold. The team also dug trenches and set up booby traps in anticipation of the regime's advance. Flint's tactical acumen was evident in every decision made. Each move was calculated to maximize their defensive advantage. Meanwhile, Flint's intelligence team, bolstered by the undercover operatives, worked tirelessly to gather information on the regime's movements and plans. They set up a network of informants and used advanced surveillance techniques to monitor enemy activity. The intelligence gathered was crucial in anticipating the regime's strategies and preparing countermeasures. With the threat of renewed conflict looming, Flint placed a strong emphasis on training and maintaining morale among his fighters. He organized drills and tactical exercises to ensure that everyone was prepared for the possibility of a major engagement. These sessions were grueling but necessary, and Flint led by example, participating actively and pushing his team to their limits. During these intense periods, Flint also made time to check in with his team on a personal level. He knew that the psychological toll of the prolonged conflict could be just as damaging as the physical demands. He held regular briefings, but also made an effort to connect with his fighters individually, offering support and encouragement. The regime's counteroffensive came as expected, with a coordinated assault on multiple fronts. Flint's team was ready. As the enemy forces advanced, they encountered the full force of Flint's preparations. The fortified positions held firm, and the regime's advances were met with fierce resistance. In one of the critical battles, Flint found himself leading a counterattack to push back an enemy push that had breached their outer defenses. The fighting was brutal and unrelenting, but Flint's tactical adjustments and the sheer determination of his fighters began to turn the tide. "We've got to drive them back," Flint shouted through the din of battle. "Hold the line and push forward." The combat was intense, with both sides exchanging heavy fire. Flint's strategic adjustments, such as redirecting reinforcements and using guerrilla tactics, were crucial in regaining the upper hand. Slowly but surely, Flint's team managed to repel the enemy forces, forcing them to retreat. Despite the immediate success, Flint knew the conflict was far from over. The regime, although pushed back, was still a formidable foe, and the war was likely to continue with renewed intensity. Flint used the temporary lull to regroup and reassess their position. During this period, Flint also took the opportunity to strengthen alliances with other resistance groups. They held meetings and coordinated efforts to create a unified front against the regime. This collaborative approach not only bolstered their strength but also expanded their resources and intelligence network. In the quiet moments between battles, Flint reflected on the cost of the conflict. He walked through the compound, observing the damage and the scars left by the fighting. Each face he saw was a reminder of the sacrifices made and the resilience shown. One evening, as Flint looked out over the compound, he found himself pondering the future. He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he remained hopeful. The spirit of resistance was strong, and the dream of a free and just world kept him motivated. Flint continued to lead with a blend of tactical brilliance and compassionate leadership. His focus remained on both immediate tactical successes and long-term strategic goals. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the resistance remained united and effective. The conflict with the regime had reached a critical juncture, but Flint's resolve was unshaken. He knew that every battle fought and every sacrifice made brought them one step closer to their ultimate goal. With the support of his team and the strength of their cause, Flint remained committed to fighting for a future free from oppression.